Looking Glass, just outside the city of Roseburg, in the fertile landscape of southwest Oregon. A young couple makes their living on a dairy farm. After a long day's labor, the farmer and his wife turn in for bed shortly after midnight.
He said about 15 minutes later there was a knock at the door. He put on his pants, he went to the door, he opened it, and as soon as that door opened, he had a shotgun in his face and was back in the living room.
At the other end of the shotgun, two masked men. One keeps an eye on the husband, while the other makes his way through the house.
One of the suspects went down the hall, found his wife, brought her into the living room and laid her down next to her husband and told her, he said, "Lady, if you resist me, he's going to shoot your husband."
After raping the wife, the attackers ransack the couple's home. They steal $60 in cash and then flee the scene. The victims can offer few clues as to the identity of their attackers or fathom any reason why they were targeted.
All we had to go on was two males, about 5'8" to 6'2", stockings over their faces, one armed with a rifle, one with a shotgun. One had a kind of a high-pitched voice. And basically, that was it.
Several unknown fingerprints are lifted from the crime scene, prints that detectives compare against a dozen possible suspects to no avail. Within a month, investigators have exhausted their leads, and the case goes cold. On December 26, 1974, Detective Gary Lease gets a call. An anonymous female claims to have information on the rape and robbery and offers up the names of two suspects, Benny King and Kenneth Nail.
She told us that like 3 days after the crime had occurred that she had spoke with Kenneth Nail and that he told her, he said, "Do you remember the robbery that took place out in Looking Glass?" She said, "Yes, I heard about that." And he said, "Well, I was the one that held the gun to the husband's head while Benny King raped his wife."
Police pick up Benny King at his grandmother's house in Roseburg.
And he immediately confessed that he was involved with Kenneth Nail in that robbery and that he was the one that raped this young lady.
King lays out his role in the crime, and police book him. Next, detectives pay a visit to the county jail, where their second suspect, Kenneth Nail, is serving time on an unrelated charge.
And then he told us basically everything that happened, that he was there with Benny King, and he told us he was doing speed that night, and they decided to go find a house to rob. It was a random drive-by. They said the house looked good. They decided that was the one they were going to go rob, see if they could get some money.
While Nail sits in the jail cell, Benny King is bailed out by his grandmother. 2 months later, on the day he is to appear in court, King is a no-show. Kenneth Nail pleads guilty to his part in the rape and robbery and is sentenced to 20 years. The whereabouts of Benny King, however, remains a mystery, one that eventually grows into a Roseburg legend. Where was Benny King? It's a question that hangs in the air for more than a generation. High above the city of Roseburg, deep in the Callahan Mountains, the air is cool and wet. On the afternoon of October 20th, 1998, a couple scours these woods, hoping for a taste of the season's first mushrooms. What they find, peeking out from the ground cover, however, is a human skull. Scattered among the remains, police find personal effects, items that tell police Benny King never made it to Canada or even California, that his legend ended in a grave just a few miles outside of Roseburg.
There was a little medallion and some other items that made us think of Benny King. So when we found that these were bones that had been up there for several years, his was kind of the first name that popped into mind.
Mitochondrial DNA testing confirms the hunch. After 23 years, the search for Benny King is over. And although some in Roseburg say King got what was coming to him, the fact is he was murdered. A fact that doesn't sit right with the lawmen of Douglas County. The problem is, they had neither the men nor the time to work cold cases.
The unit that I have consists of 8 investigators that cover a whole wide variety of things. And we get really, like probably all departments across the country, we just stay really, really busy. So it's hard to look back into the past very far and work these cases.
To get the job done, the department will need the help of a special group of volunteers. A posse of retired lawmen who call themselves the Cold Case Cowboys. Tom Hall worked as a U.S. postal inspector on the West Coast for 27 years. Sid Boyle is a retired police detective who now runs a cattle ranch. Thomas Schultz worked at law enforcement for 23 years as an officer and then a polygraph examiner. Al Olson retired as the chief of police in Morro Bay and Pacifica, California. These 4 men make up Douglas County's volunteer cold case squad. Combined, they bring over 100 years of experience to the investigative table. The murder book on Benny King is several volumes long. Each of the cowboys takes a binder and begins to read.
He put himself in with a group of people who wouldn't hesitate to do him harm.
Among that group, a man named Lewis Clark. Clark's name first appears in a 1984 statement given to police by another Roseburg undesirable named Gary Holland.
There was a guy named Gary Holland who had told police in years past that he was on a road trip with some other guys, and a guy named Clark had told him that he had killed Benny King, and that's where he got the money for his Harley.
Lacking a body or any other physical evidence, investigators in 1984 could not substantiate Holland's claim. 14 years later, Benny King's bones put a ring of truth to the biker's road tale. As the cowboys try to get a line on the biker's whereabouts, a phone rings up at the county sheriff's office.
There was an anonymous call into the sheriff's office who said the person who killed Benny King is Carlos Tinker, and he did it because Kenneth Nail hired him to kill Benny so he wouldn't testify.
In early 1975, Carlos Tinker was locked up in Douglas County Jail on a probation violation. When the Cold Case Cowboys pull old prison records, they discover Kenneth Nail was doing time in the same jail, making a murder-for-hire scenario more than plausible. On May 21st, Tom Hall and Thomas Schultz make their way to Salem, Oregon, to talk to Tinker and see if his jailhouse boasts hold water.
I was involved in it. I was there. It's been a long time I've been carrying this weight. I just want to get rid of it.
Tinker tells detectives that he was so infuriated by Benny King's alleged crime and lack of punishment that he decided to take the law into his own hands.
He committed a very heinous crime, and it was felt that he needed to be terminated.
I think the main thing was that he'd raped the girl, and then was going to get away with it. That was it.
Tinker tells detectives he got out of county jail 2 days later and immediately began making plans for murder, enlisting the help of his girlfriend to dig a grave in the Callahan Mountains.
Then 2 days later, I enlisted the help of Lewis Clark because he had a vehicle, and he also had a friend with a sawed-off 12-gauge. Once the act was done, you can't tell anybody. It didn't prove anything. It didn't prove anything to me because I sure as hell wasn't any tougher. I was scared to death, and I couldn't tell anybody about it.
He was relieved to get this information off of his mind. He had nightmares. He told us he had nightmares at times over this horrendous killing.
It's been a long time I've been carrying this weight.
The cowboys have their confession from Tinker, but there is still a loose end named Lewis Clark. What exactly was his involvement, and will he corroborate Tinker's statement? Al Olson and Sid Boyle track down Clark in Parker, Arizona, and decide to pay him a surprise visit.
Well, he answered the door and started in with the Volkswagen story, and when I informed him that I wasn't going to listen to it, that he either tell the truth now or next time he saw me I'd have a warrant in my hand, he at that point decided he'd give us the story. And
now we have not only the confession from the shooter, but we have the person that was with him at the time of the shooting telling the same exact story that the shooter Tinker was telling.
Lewis Clark's statement is the final bit of evidence the Cold Case Cowboys need. On September 9, 2003, Johnny Carlos Tinker pleads guilty to murder and is sentenced to life in prison. As for the Cold Case Cowboys, they've gone on to solve a second case and are currently working on a third. Their story has gained nationwide media coverage, and the four are in talks with a major motion picture studio about developing a Cold Case Cowboys movie.
If there's just a handful of more homicides solved, it would be great.